So we're just getting coffee. Oh, excellent. All right. Welcome, everybody. Can you guys in the back hear me okay? And I'm hoping that people online can hear us. If you can't, please put something in the chat and somebody will let me know. So, welcome, everybody. I am Sheila Heymans. I will be your moderator today, and I want to welcome you here to our Brown Bag Lunch, which is hosted by the Bamboo Project. And I need to make sure that I keep all my get all my notes right. So welcome to the people in the room. For those of you who are in the room, there's still some sandwiches in the back of the room. For those of you online, I'm afraid you have to eat your own sandwiches at home. So I will move to the next slide. So I want to start off just with a quick sort of introduction about the European Marine Board and the project, and then we'll go straight into the more interesting sciencey bits. So who are the Marine Board? Who is the Marine Board? We are a science policy think tank that bridges the gap between marine science and policymakers, and we try to provide high policy advice, high level advice, high quality advice. We are a membership organization, independent membership organization from marine research performing organizations, funders of marine research and university consortia across Europe. We have 38 members in 19 countries across Europe. We have a secretariat that's hosted in Ostend, and our chair is Fiona Grant from the Marine Institute in Ireland. If you're interested in any more of our work, for the people in the room, we have some of our documents outside at the door, but also you can follow us on social media, and I would definitely suggest you subscribe to our newsletter for those of you who haven't done so yet. So today we will have two presentations. I will go a little bit more into the Bamboo Project, but then we'll have two presentations from one from Pedro Vinagre, who is going to talk about the natural impacts and benefits of floating solar, and Gerdien de Vries, who will be talking about the potential social impacts and benefits of floating solar. And then we will have an interactive discussion. For the people online, you will hear the presentations, but then we will basically stop the Zoom and we will have a discussion internally here following Chatham House rules. So we will have an open discussion and we will not be taking notes. So it will just be an open discussion on that. Quickly, a brief overview on the Bamboo Project. It is a Horizon Europe project that is on building scaled modular bamboo-inspired offshore solar systems. That's the purpose of the project. It started on the 1st of January last year, and the vision is really to enable Europe's approach to offshore renewable energy by developing a groundbreaking offshore solar system that spans 1 square kilometer with an installation capacity of 50 to 200 megawatts that can fit between offshore wind turbines and can have a complementary generation profile. If you want to know anything more about the mechanics of it all, Bridget, who is the expert, is in the back of the room, so she will definitely be able to answer any of those questions. And there we go. And so why would you want to do this? I think there's some risks involved, but why is it actually a good thing to try and put floating solar between these wind farms? Because as you can see here in a simulation that's done for the North Sea, in the times of the year where there's not so much wind, there's actually quite a lot of sun. So if you actually can put these two things in the same place, you can use the same sort of infrastructure and the cable connections and all of that. This is a non-electrical engineer explanation. The pictures on the right-hand side here, you can actually see when the Oceans of Energy colleagues were taking their device out into the North Sea. So you can actually see there how it has already worked so far. The ambition of the project is then to tackle the challenges and barriers that there might be for implementing this sustainable large-scale offshore solar system of 1 square kilometer. 50 to 200 megawatts, and to be able to act as an industry standard for the rollout of this type of projects. So you can see on the graphics here how it will look, the width and the length of these between the wind farms. And note also that actually it's not actually planned to cover all of the space between all of the wind farms, but I think at the moment there's only about 4 or 5 of these that's needed in order to get to the scale level that's required. So the context of this discussion is during this project, we actually had a workshop on the subject matter workshop on the impacts, social and natural impacts and benefits of doing this. That was held in April in Brussels. We had participants that range from natural to social sciences, and they discussed both the negative and positive impacts of, solar, wind, or the two things combined, and actually looking at the large scale and small scale deployments that might be needed for this. And it also considered the different sea basins. So it's not just the North Sea perspective, but we had people from all the other sea basins there as well. So today we will have a talk by 2 of the people who were there at the time. Dr. Pedro Vinagre, who I'm sure I'm not pronouncing your last name right. He's a marine ecologist at Wavik in Portugal. He has extensive experience in environmental impacts and environmental monitoring, specifically for offshore projects. And he is an active expert. He's active in the expert groups of ICES and GESAMP that work on these matters. And then our second talk is Dr. Ferdien de Vries. Sorry. She's an associate professor in climate psychology at Delft University, and she's got extensive research. Has done extensive research on human responses to climate change and participating in the energy transition. So we really have a very natural science and social science perspective. So I'm going to stop speaking, and Pedro is going to give you his talk, and then Ferdien is going to go afterwards, and then we will have a discussion. We'll open the floor for clarification, but then the people online will be kicked out of Zoom, and we will talk about it here in the room. So here we go, Pedro.
Thank you, Sheila. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Pedro from Portugal. I thank EMB for inviting me to stay today, also to the attendance in person, also online. I will be briefly talking about potential environmental impacts of offshore photovoltaic. But mostly I would like to highlight the dual nature of these potential impacts. So, and this both at demonstration and large-scale deployments. So first, also to highlight that many times generalization is not possible. The potential impacts, both positive and negative, are many times context-specific. They might be different, or they might have very different magnitudes depending on the location, obviously the size and the type of installation, depending on local, natural, and social contexts, the presence of sensitive areas, for example, migration routes. Therefore, many of these assessments need to be context and local specific. We have many different types of impacts, both positive or negative. They also can be combined in different ways. They can be cumulative, synergistic, or antagonistic, and they will depend on the stressor and also on the receptor. And I will just provide a few examples of this duality. One that stands out perhaps more quickly is some effects in the interaction between the air and sea. Generally, you have some effects caused by the wind interaction with the water, also the light penetration in the water, and of course, when we will have particularly large-scale deployments of floating photovoltaics, we will have some reduced interactions between air and sea. So some negative impacts that might occur, and again, these are all potential impacts. They have never been measured, so they are mostly theoretical. But for the environmental people, they are logical, at least. One could be reduced mixing because of increased shading and also the reduced wind interaction. and also reduce light penetration. And together they may change mixing of the water. They could affect phytoplankton productivity and growth. Also changes in some physical chemical parameters like dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll and nutrient availability. And all of these together can have some detrimental impacts on the food web. As positive impacts, and here these two are mostly associated with shallow water and more confined waters, which is to reduce seawater warming, potentially some evaporation, and owed to the reduced lighting, also reduced algal bloom formation, particularly the toxic species. Another example is effects on hydrodynamics. Because of these differences and because of mostly wave damping, there could be some changes in the hydrodynamic properties. Also, local currents and algal sediments can be transported. This can also cause some effects, namely reduced mixing, which can affect circulation of the sediments and also stratification of the water column, and overall changing some of the physical chemical parameters as well. As a positive impacts, and mostly owed to wave damping, could be protection of sensitive coastal areas, such as breakwaters or even other types of infrastructure. Potential reduction in coastal erosion, and this is particularly important in touristic areas, which almost all over the world occurs in coastal areas, and also benefits for co-located industries such as offshore wind, agriculture, and even ocean monitoring, for example. Another example are potential changes in the marine ecosystem and also biodiversity. So essentially, every type of artificial infrastructure will create an effect called the artificial reef effect. Basically, these structures will be colonized. They will attract by other mobile fauna, such as fish, and this is generally seen as a positive impact, which allows increasing biodiversity. It can also have, at the same time, a negative impact if some of these colonizers are non-native, and especially if they become invasive. Overall, they could use this type of infrastructure and others as a stepping stone for its proliferation, and overall change some of the, let's say, ecosystem patterns in these areas. Also, the shaded areas will provide some habitat, some protection to certain species, and this can change some predation patterns locally. As positive effects, as already mentioned, the artificial reef will attract more species. They will provide substrates for other species for colonization, and overall they may act as de facto marine protected areas. This is because generally these projects are licensed and other types of human activities are restricted in these areas, particularly trawling, fishing, which allows most populations to re-establish and have a spillover effect to adjacent areas, which in turn will benefit, for example, fisheries in these adjacent areas. I think this is the final example I'm going to provide, but in terms of particular biological groups, in this case birds and mammals, these platforms can offer resting habitat, resting sites, which otherwise wouldn't exist, potentially counteract some of the detrimental effects caused by this type of project and other human activities, and can also increase or enhance feeding opportunities because of the artificial effect, for example, as I already mentioned. However, this on the other side can also have some detrimental effects. For example, some mirror glare effects from the panels can confuse birds, can not only blind birds flying, but can also attract birds, which can increase the collision risk. They also can be let's say, physical barrier to potential migration routes, particularly marine mammals. And this the degradation of prey below and well, mostly below these platforms can also increase the collision risk. And this is particularly important when combining large-scale deployments and when combined with wind turbines, because as you may know, one of the potential impacts is bird colliding with the planes. So in terms of priority research and monitoring, we still lack a lot of information about how can food web dynamics be changed. So we need to understand particularly large-scale installations and how these changes may affect ecosystem goods and services that are provided to the human population. We need to understand many of the benefits, particularly the interest of having wave attenuation in some sites, which can also have co-benefits for other industries. We need to understand the ecosystem carrying capacity point, so basically trying to understand until when the ecosystems can be resilient to certain impacts, and also taking into consideration further exacerbation of climate change scenarios. We will need surely to continue to have more pilot and demonstration projects in the water, because we need to continue acquiring data to understand better the types and magnitudes of impacts, particularly when we want to move to a large scale. And we need to continue to establish and implement adaptive framework, management frameworks, basically flexible approaches that allow to adapt, which means could be tighten or alleviating monitoring and also mitigation measures implementation in face of the new knowledge acquired. And finally, as general considerations, as I already mentioned, we lack a lot of information. Most of the impacts that I mentioned and others that could be mentioned are mostly theoretical. So we need to increase the understanding about these impacts, particularly those that are cumulative with others, and in the case of large-scale deployments. I think it's reasonable to say that offshore floating photovoltaic systems will not operate in isolation with others. And this is particularly relevant because considering the synergies with other sectors, which could be sharing infrastructure, reducing conflicts of maritime space usage, using integrated monitoring protocols between the different types of projects. This can also increase coherence in the policy, and also having the greater goal of the climate change goals. Again, context matters. So environmental impacts and the requirements for its monitoring and also of its mitigation are mostly locally specific. It should also consider the wider sea basin context. And again, not only for a particular project, the negative impacts need to be compared against the positive impacts, but all of this needs to be compared with the inaction of the implementation of these types of projects in the broader goal of decarbonization. Pilot projects and demonstration projects obviously maximize and optimize opportunities for acquiring knowledge. This will be a backbone for future large-scale implementation, installation. And and this will also allow addressing some implications of the existing requirements, such as environmental impact assessment process, making this process a bit more coherent across countries, for example, and more or less similar between these different countries. Well, I think this is it. Thank you. I was very fast. Sorry.
I'll take my time. So my name is Gerlien de Vries. I'm an associate professor from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. I'm not part of the Bamboo project, but I was invited to the meeting in April. I was somewhere in the picture as an expert in my field. So, and again, I was now invited to give you a talk about climate psychology and also social perceptions and social research that we do. So the type of research that I will tell you about is more on different domains, different technologies, and not specifically on the technology of the Bamboo project, because I'm not part of it. So I can speculate, but I didn't do any research there. So I gave this slide because I have the brand of the climate psychologist, but it's actually not something that really exists. Environmental psychology is a part of psychology, so I think the biggest difference for audiences that are not familiar with psychology is that there's a big difference between clinical psychology, where you learn how to treat people who have depression or mental illnesses, and the type of psychology that studies the human behavior, which is more from the point of view how we all in general behave. So I'm not a clinical psychologist, I am that other type. And the sub part of psychology then is that this part that I study climate and energy related issues. So that is a part of environmental psychology. But if you look at the broader field of environmental psychology, there are also psychologists who research, for instance, how people behave within hospitals or prisons, etc. So people in relation to their environment. And specifically, I'm looking into the ecological environment. So that is a bit of a background so that you can understand where I come from. And why is it relevant to study human behavior in our field, so climate change and energy transition? I'm doing this all now for more than 15 years, and we see increasingly also reported in the IPCC reports that human behavior is mentioned as a very important part of the energy transition, and how people have their lifestyles, but also how they interact in relation to new technologies and new policies is very relevant and important. So the demand side is found increasingly important, which we also see in funding opportunities. So I often am part of big projects that have a technical component, and then we have a work package, something to do with social science. And when I started years ago, that was often also being done by the engineers, and now we see also from the funding side that more and more it is being asked that social scientists are actually also involved in projects. So we see that, and we also see it from the demands that we get from policymakers. For instance, also in the Netherlands, we have several groups of behavioral scientists who are often invited to discuss and talk along with the policymakers about policies, which is very interesting and relevant. To give you an overview of this field that I work in and the technologies that I do research with, this is a ChatGPT generated picture who I asked to try to combine everything I do in one picture. So that the technologies are really all over the place, from the big ones that have to do with geoengineering to really the small ones, which is, for instance, a very cool project that we do on social dynamics in public EV charging stations. So we actually are looking at how people behave surrounding public charging stations, because we found, okay, there's this the smart systems and these technologies can do a lot, but it has some impact also on how people live with their neighbors in a neighborhood sharing these EV charging points. There's a large behavioral component, for instance. We also do research on infrared heating in social housing. But a big chunk of the research that I do has to do with social perceptions and social acceptance. So actually I did my PhD years ago on perceptions about carbon dioxide capture and storage technology. At that time there was a big pilot project in the Netherlands that was delayed and eventually cancelled, which was in the middle of my PhD project. So also my funding was a bit on the roof. But eventually we did a lot of experiments, so not really in the field, but we found a lot of information also on how people perceive these big technologies that have maybe also a scary element or a complex element that people don't understand that much. And that also relates, I think, a bit to the Bamboo project, where we found out that a lot of the communications coming, for instance, from the developers or from governments that are also related to the technologies can have a big impact on what people feel about the technology. So I will tell a little bit more about it, but it's also open for discussion later to ask me anything about that. So a lot of the social scientific research, or all the projects we do on the picture before, starts with a behavioral analysis. We started a course also in our university, a master level course on behavioral analysis. So it's called Behavior in Transitions. And 2 years ago, the time was there for our engineering students to get a course on behavior. So before that, we were a bit hesitant, but actually we got also a lot of questions from the students. So maybe we can learn a little bit more about that, because we already found that there was a bit of a gap, that engineers could end their studies, so like 6 years of engineering studies, and not knowing at all about the behavior that is related to the technologies that they make. We actually also found in some of the studies that we do that the engineers can have an optimism bias if it relates to the technology that they are developing. And we say that that's very good to do that. So please don't be bothered by any of these thoughts later on, because you need the creativity and the innovation stage to create things. But in the end, it's good to know that there is a behavioral component. And if you created this very cool technology, but no one wants to use it, or you haven't asked people how they want to use it in a further stage of development, in which you can still tweak things, for instance, to make it more acceptable, that is relevant. So we start our research with a behavioral analysis, and that includes always what type of behavior is of interest. So the word behavior is very often used very loosely, but for us environmental psychologists, it's a very, very, very important word, because it determines a lot of things. So who is behaving? How are they behaving now? What's the wish behavior, so the targeted behavior, especially for policymaking. It's really important. If you talk about behavior change, you can say, okay, we want people out of cars and into the public transport. But what is really the behavior change that you want to have? Do you want to have the car owners stop driving cars or minimize their car use, or do you want to increase the number of people who use the public transport? So it's really important to be clear about your target group and the behavior that you have envisioned. And often it can, of course, policy can be related to multiple groups and multiple behaviors, but then the type of behavior or the type of policy that you design in the end is really important. So behavior can be a lot of things. So we are very clear always in our projects to take a lot of time for this first part, and then go along and see what we are going to do with the research. So if this is very targeted, it's also easier to study people. So in general, social acceptance is often mentioned, and it's also a big part of the work that we do, but it's not everything. And also for people like me who work in a University of Technology, we are often invited, so okay, we created this and this, can you do a social acceptance research? And then in order for us, for instance, to get funding for the part that we do, we have to do a little bit more than only finding out the social acceptance. So what we often also try is to get involved very early. We did a project, so actually next week, one of my PhD researchers that I supervise is defending her work on social acceptance of airborne wind energy, which is wind created by kites, which is in a very early stage of development. So it's not commercialized yet, but the engineers working on it really felt, okay, we want to involve a social scientist very early. And the cool thing is that she could do research on in pilot projects. So she already found out a lot of things that she could feed back to the engineers, which makes them, also it helps them to further design their developments with the knowledge that we already know. So one of the things that we found, for instance, is that they measured the number of decibels that these kites make, and then you can see, okay, it's lower than a classic wind farm. But in the end, if you ask people, okay, what do you hear? People who live in the vicinity of these plants, they hear an irregular noise. So it's lower decibel, but it's more irregular and infrequent. So it could be, in the end, be more annoying to some people. And this is actually also, then we did an acoustic experiment in the lab, etc. So these kinds of things are very interesting. So what we found with a lot of these researches is that the process is often very important. We often see that there's, for instance, some resistance towards technology. People go, this is also ChatGPT, this is Delft where I work. This is not real, but it's a main square. So that just as a disclaimer, there was no protest in that. But we find out that with a lot of these technologies, people protest because of the process, because something was unfair in the process. They were involved late, or they felt that the industry and government already made some decisions before they were involved. So what we see then is that there's not really a resistance towards the technology pure to itself, because if you ask them, okay, what do you think about geothermal energy, wind farms, airborne wind, whatever, either they don't care or they find it interesting, but okay, what do I have to do with it if they drill somewhere far, far away? But if they see that it's something that has to, that relates to them and also to the process how something went along and that something is suddenly placed near their houses, then that's often the problem. So, and I also added here that we also found in different researches that there's a big silent middle group. So the people that you hear are either the people who really like the project or are involved in the project. We also find in some, for instance, media analysis that a lot of the media are fed by people who are proponents, for instance. So that's people who are maybe spending money on it or really want a project to come there. There's less attention to this big middle field because people just don't speak up in that big middle field. And the opponents are, of course, also loud because they're going to demonstrate because it's close to their heart. So, do not forget the silent middle. There's often a big group of people that is either indifferent or accepting, but doesn't speak out that much. So when we do the behavior analysis and we do our research, it's also good to know that we make a difference between two broad types of determinants of behavior. So if you look at behavior, you have to take into account that behavior is affected, of course, by different determinants. And what we easily do also in our courses is just make a big difference between intrapersonal processes, so the things that happen within your head, which is the purely psychological process that have to do with trust or your experience or your personality or your emotions, and the contextual processes, that's everything happening outside of you and your head, which can be the processes between you and government or communication or politics or money or wherever you live, but also social factors. So people surrounding you, your family, people that you identify with, norms that you perceive which are either real or not, but that you find important. So it's good to always think, and we are also doing this more and more now, that we maybe create these big maps of analysis of behavior and the determinants. I have a picture of that really looks scary. So I take a lot of the time from you now, Pedro. So thanks. Thanks for being short. So I think communication is a very important contextual factor that actually, of course, can influence behavior. But it's not the only one itself. Sometimes it's the easy linear model that people have in their mind that if you give people knowledge and they get a positive attitude because of that knowledge, that their behavior will accordingly change into a positive way. And we actually all know that it's not true. You can have a positive attitude about going to the gym, know that it's good for you, but still don't go. And in that part between that you want to go, so you have a good intention, but to the real action, there's a big gap. And that's one of the most famous gaps in psychology, the intention-action gap. Because there it really gets interesting for us to see what happens there. Why, if you have the money and you have the technology and the willingness, the motivations, everything, all the lights are on green, why don't you go and do that? There's often the psychological interesting bits. So communication is important, and what we see from the research that we did with other technologies up till now is that it really helps to be clear in your communication, but also, and I think that's the one thing that I want to take out also from this, the balanced one. What we see is that if people have the impression, so people of the general public, that the communication they get about a certain technology is one-sided framed in a positive way, for instance, because the developers are really enthusiastic about it. It's not like a lie. But sometimes you think, okay, this is good for the environment, it's better than we had before, everybody will like it, then if you don't mention the negative sides of it, people are inclined to come up with that themselves. So there might be a group of people that say, okay, if this only the positive things are mentioned in communication, what could be the negative things? And sometimes it's even worse than the real negative things about a technology, because people might come up with a lot of things, especially if the process, what I showed you before, is not trusted, or the parties behind it are not trusted. So is there a low trust in government, or there's a low trust in, for instance, a certain oil and gas industry, as we saw in my research on CCS. If the general trust is low, then of course there could be all kinds of thoughts that people can have. So it's good to be open, transparent, balanced, use simple language, because we also found that sometimes, because if a lot of details are shared from a technology, the main message is snowed under. I'm not sure if that's an English expression. The delusion effect, so it's really, what you really want to say is not being seen anymore by people because you have said so many things. That's, I think, in general what we learned from communication about these technologies. So then I'm almost at the interesting scary map. This is not a scary map yet. Whose behavior are we talking about? I already touched upon it. There are multiple players, multiple people who behave. I actually work at the Department of Multi-Actor Systems, so we're really fond of researching all the actors in a system. Then we see, okay, when we talk about technology and social acceptance, the focus is often on members of the general public who can resist or not. But all these parties involved are really interesting parties to analyze, and know more about their behavior. Because sometimes, if you talk about social acceptance, a change should not really come from the general public, but maybe from the policymaker, or maybe from the engineer, or maybe from the researcher, or the journalist, or whoever. So there are a lot of people in this system who have behavior which is related to a technology, and sometimes, for instance, subsidies need to be made for people to afford a certain technology in their house, or journalists need to be trained. What we see, for instance, with heat pump installation, a lot of the installers need to be trained, and also we found out with researching them that they are often a bit older, they are trained in a certain way, and find it really hard to be trained in another way. So they give their old information to people, and that's not the newest information about heat pumps. So we know, okay, the behavior change should be more in the training of the installers. This is the scary map. What we actually do, this is published, but you can find it, and there's also Kai Bellman, who's also one of the PhD researchers in my group. He has researched a lot of Dutch policymakers who have to do something with climate adaptation policy. He studied them for, I think, over a year, so interviews, workshops, get back to them with information, say, okay, what is also, you don't actually have to read it, I know. It's not possible. But what he asked them is, so what's holding you back? What facilitates you to make the best possible policy on climate adaptation? And for instance, we found out that the policymakers in the smaller municipalities in the Netherlands look up to the bigger cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, and see what they are doing. Or what they said, it's very important how management supports us, or it's very important how big our portfolio is already, because we see, even especially in smaller cities, the policymakers have a lot of things to do, and what to prioritize when, and also how to connect this maybe to other disciplines or other groups within the municipalities is very important. So Kai also wrote a paper on how to do this behavioral system mapping. It's a white paper now, it will come out soon, but this is a bit of the future that we head towards within our field, to really try and see how all these different behaviors connect to each other, and where are the levers that we can actually advise on, for instance, for other people to do something, because we say, okay, we need to train people, or we need really make sure that people can interact, all these different policymakers on different levels. So that's, I think, bringing me to an end. This is the behavior change implementation part, what I said, okay, based on these behavioral analysis, which can be also a bit more simple than the behavior system map. It's good to also think about if you, as a policymaker, for instance, want to do something with behavior change related to technology. Try and find out, okay, what can you change? Do the behavior analysis. Can you do it yourself? Do you have to hire people, etc. And there are two methods that are often used. I think the European Union also has, a Commission also has a report on a way how they work with these kinds of behavior change methods. But the behavior change wheel is often used. The references are near that. This is a fairly simple one. It looks especially at capability, motivation, and opportunity, and there are a lot of extra things that you can do. And actually, this is also a very cool one, the Behavior Works method, which is developed in Australia, which also could really help to say, okay, what's the problem-focused exploration, behavioral analysis part, going into, okay, what theories do we know about this type of behavior, towards the practice part, actually making your policy. Okay, that brought me to the end of my presentation. This is a nice quote from a very nice book. If you're interested in the work that I do, I would definitely recommend reading this. And it shows this quote why it's so interesting from a behavior perspective to study this. So, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I think we have time for some questions for clarification. If anybody wants to ask any questions online, maybe is there any online? Paula, Anna? No? Yeah, Celine.
Thank you. It was very good also to see the multidisciplinarity of the project. I had a question of more on the environmental impact aspect. Since this project, it was part of the tender for the offshore wind project, I think. No, sorry. Anyway, more generally, if that has to be the case, and because you work very closely with them, do you envisage to have some common environmental impact assessment, for example, like some common monitoring already plans? How do you organize with them, with the wind sector?
You wanna?
You can start with that, or I can start.
Well, I can start with, well, I will speak on what is commonly done. Maybe we can then deepen the talk with what Ocean already did. But generally, first depends on the scale of the project and the type of the project. For example, in the European Union, the environmental impact assessment directly as mandatory projects, or projects which environmental impact assessment is mandatory, depending on certain characteristics, and others which are not. Generally, smaller projects, like pilot or demonstration projects, are not subject to environmental impact assessment, but let's say a smaller environmental impact statement personally. And this is generally project specific. So let's say it might there be no other project, but let's say there is already an offshore wind project in place, and then there comes the same area. So this project will already have a license for the use of the maritime space, and will already have an ongoing or finished environmental licensing and environmental impact assessment process. Generally, these are separate, and I think the goal will be to start to have these integrated, so that duplication is avoided. So if you already did 1, 3, 4 agreement, why the other projects should again do the 1, 3, 4. If the information is recent and it's valid and it's sound, then they should integrate it. I don't know exactly how we should do that.
Before we go into too much of a discussion, I just wanted to check if there, I'm going to just let me speak here. Before we go into too much of a discussion, are there any other questions from online? Because otherwise I think it makes sense that we stop the online now. And then, so for the people online, thank you very much. I think we'll stop now because the discussion in the room is going to get complicated for you guys to follow anyway. So thank you very much, and for everybody, it will be on YouTube anyway afterwards, if you want to rewatch it again. And you can always contact us if you have more questions for the speakers. So